Well, we have two magnificent readings today. I'll focus just on the first, that still startling account of the conversion of Saul. You know, it's mentioned three separate times in the Acts of the Apostles, also referenced in Paul's own letters. I think it's fair to say it had a pretty big impact on him and on the early church. Think about who he was. Shaul, this kid from Tarsus, obviously brilliant, so that's clear from every page he ever wrote. He would have been formed certainly in the Jewish tradition very deeply. So every little thing I said this morning and 1,000 things more, young Shaul would have known about the Hebrew scriptures, the expectations of his people. He was also certainly trained in rhetoric and philosophy, and that's also pretty clear in his letters. So he was a, cross-cultural sort of person. As a probably pretty young man, he's sent to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel, one of the leading rabbis of the time. So he was recognized as brilliant and promising the way we might send someone for, specialized advanced studies. So young Shaul is there in Jerusalem, certainly acquainted with Gamaliel, the scriptures, but also with the temple and its rhythms and sacrifices. Also, certainly he would have been caught up in the messianic expectation of that moment. So for a lot of reasons, much of it having to do with the book of Daniel, there was an intense messianic expectation at this time. Then he hears about Jesus, a carpenter from Nazareth who was put to death in the most brutal way by the Romans. Young Shaul would have known there'd be no clearer possible indication that someone was not the Mashiach of Israel than his death at the hands of Israel's enemies. Because the Mashiach, the anointed one, the new David, was meant to be the victorious king over the enemies of the nation. Therefore, if he was put to death publicly by the enemies of Israel, he was clearly not the Mashiach. Hence, burning with zeal for the traditions of his fathers, and we know people across the centuries up to the present day who have that mentality, and young Shaul had it. Of course he was angry with the Christians. Of course he thought these were desperately bad, heretical figures. With that attitude, he's making his way to Damascus when this thing happened to him. Blinded by the light, hearing the voice, "Who are you, sir?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Blindness, and he's so shocked he doesn't eat and drink for 3 days. Something had to end about the way he was seeing things. Something had to end about his old life. And then through the ministration of Ananias, he recovers his sight, he's baptized. And we know that, right away he does begin preaching, but the most important thing is he tells us himself in Galatians, for 3 years to Arabia. Now, that's a bit like saying, I went out west. He went somewhere, he went far away. N.T. Wright speculates he went to Mount Sinai. Here's this man just immersed in the traditions of Israel. But he's had this experience of the one he was utterly convinced could not be the Mashiach of Israel. The risen Jesus speaks to him. So what's he doing for those 3 years? We don't really know. But I think it's pretty evident he was trying to figure it out. He was trying not to abandon Israel, but to reread Israel now in light of the resurrection. Not abandoning Israel, that would be a kind of Marcionism, right? But rereading Israel in light of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And in a way, everybody, this is where Christian theology is born. Augustine, Aquinas, and Rahner and Balthasar and everybody else are basically footnotes to that move. How do you read Israel in light of the dying and rising of Jesus? That's Christianity. That's Christian theology. What does he come to see? Scales fell from his eyes. An old way of seeing gave way to a new way of seeing. That yes, he was the Mashiach of Israel. Yes, he was the new David, but in the most unexpected manner. The Mashiach was expected to deal with the enemies of Israel. What Shaul, now Paul the Apostle, understands is that's how he dealt with them. By taking upon himself all the negativity of the world, hatred and cruelty and violence and injustice and all of it, and swallowing it up in the divine mercy. That's how he won the great battle, not by fighting with the weapons of the world, but by swallowing up the world's evil in the divine mercy. The Mashiach would cleanse and purify the temple. Young Shaul knew that. He saw now that's exactly where it happened, because that cross becomes the place of perfect sacrifice. Christ's blood shed is both human blood and divine blood. The blood of human reparation, the blood of the divine mercy, covering our sins. So the temple was renewed. And then finally, the Mashiach, young Shaul knew, would reign as the Lord of the nations. King of the Jews, indeed, the new David, he'd become, by extension, the king of the world. And so it happened. Above that cross is Pontius Pilate's sign, meant to be a joke. Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Here's your king, this pathetic figure with a crown of thorns, dying hopelessly on the cross. But the Apostle Paul saw, in fact, this is the Lord of the nations. Risen from the dead is now the one to whom our final allegiance is due. And now we understand exactly what Paul was doing when he was proclaiming, as he says again and again in his letters, Jesus Kyrios, Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is Lord, because Caesar was Lord. Kaiser Kyrios was a watchword of the time. Paul says not Kaiser Kyrios, but Jesus Kyrios. The real good news I mentioned this morning doesn't have to do with Caesar and his generals. It has to do with the one Caesar killed and whom God raised up. This is called evangelization. Paul becomes the greatest of the evangelists. You see, too, by the way, why Paul spent a lot of his time in jail. Because they knew exactly what he was saying. I mean, we can hear that in a very spiritualized way. Jesus Christ is Lord. They didn't. They knew exactly what he meant. He meant there's a new king, there's a new allegiance due. It's not to Caesar, it's to him. That's why read the Acts of the Apostles again. How many times riots broke out when Paul preached? How tepid and tame our preaching seems, right, by comparison. They knew what he meant. And the Apostle Paul knew he was declaring, in fact, the new David, King of the Jews and King of the nations. That's why none of us would be here were it not for the conversion of Shaul. None of us would be here unless that young man had gone off to Arabia and figured this out. And everybody, we've got the same task. We've got the same task. Declaring the lordship of the crucified and risen Jesus. Ask the Apostle Paul to bless you today, to clarify your mind, to set your heart on fire, so that we can accomplish the same mission that he had.